The chandeliers blazed like captive constellations, their crystal arms shimmering with the heat of 100 candles, casting a brilliance across the ballroom that made every flaw invisible, save for the flaws of reputation. Silk skirts swirled in time with violins, powdered wigs nodded approvingly, and laughter rippled like champagne poured too quickly. Amidst this spectacle of polished youth and carefully rehearsed gaiety, Lady Eleanor Ashcombe stood as though she were an antique vase placed among fresh-cut blooms, dignified, valuable, but deemed unfashionable by those who prized novelty above depth. She was 40 years of age, a span the ton considered perilous, and though her figure remained upright, her composure unmarred, her solitude had made her an easy quarry for whispers. A cluster of girls no older than 20, their cheeks pink with champagne and triumph at new engagements, tittered behind their gloved hands as Eleanor passed. Imagine, one murmured, too loud to be mistaken for discretion, to arrive again and again, season after season, with no ring to show for it. Another chimed, a living warning for us all. Fortune and beauty fade, but desperation lingers. The words struck Eleanor's ears like frost in April, sudden, biting, undeserved. She did not falter, for she had learned long ago that to show wound was to give them satisfaction. Instead, she walked on, her satin gown the color of midnight gliding soundlessly, her chin lifted as if the cruel chorus were beneath her notice. Yet inside her chest, dignity battled exhaustion, and every cruel syllable pressed against the tender truth she had tried so long to deny, that society saw her as a relic, her worth measured not by her mind or kindness, but by the absence of a husband at her side. Across the ballroom, the arrival of the Duke of Wexford shifted the air like the first notes of an overture. Tall, broad-shouldered, his bearing sharpened by years in Parliament and tempered by battlefields far from these gilded halls, he carried with him both authority and sorrow. Only months had passed since the funeral of his Duchess, a woman adored for her charm, and many whispered it was too soon for him to appear in such public gaiety. Yet he came, not with a smile, but with a countenance carved from composure, as though he had resolved to confront society rather than retreat from it. His title made him an object of relentless fascination, and young ladies and their ambitious mothers fluttered like moths toward his orbit, their eyes gleaming with hopes of conquest. But the Duke did not look at them. Instead, his gaze, searching, almost weary, drifted across the hall until it found Lady Eleanor. She stood near a marble pillar, her hand resting lightly upon the carved stone, her posture a fortress of pride. In that instant, something stirred in his expression, a flicker not of pity but of recognition, as if in her solitude he discovered a reflection of his own. Eleanor, feeling the weight of eyes upon her, turned slightly, and her breath caught when she found his attention fixed upon her. He inclined his head in a deliberate bow, a gesture simple yet scandalous in its direction, for all others expected his acknowledgment to belong to fresher faces. A hush rippled through the assembly, subtle yet undeniable, like the intake of air before a storm. Whispers began at once, sharp and hungry. The Duke, surely not her? He honors her out of pity, nothing more. Perhaps he mistakes her for someone else. But no, his eyes remained, steady as stone, upon Eleanor. A conflict kindled within her. Part of her longed to look away, to shield herself from the cruel scrutiny this single gesture provoked. Yet another part, one that had endured years of silence and dismissal, yearned to accept the rare dignity of being seen. She gave the smallest nod in return, restrained but unmistakable, and in that quiet exchange the balance of the night shifted. The orchestra swelled, couples swept across the polished floor, yet Eleanor felt herself suspended, her heart caught between dread and a fragile spark of hope. Around her, the murmurs multiplied. A dowager near the refreshment table whispered of impropriety. A young baronet laughed that the Duke merely sought conversation with the only woman not already engaged in one. The cruelty pressed like thorns, but beneath it lay an ember Eleanor had not dared to feel for years, the possibility that she was not invisible. Still, fear tethered her thoughts. She recalled the humiliation endured at countless assemblies, the polite but dismissive smiles, the invitations that arrived late if they arrived at all. What cruelty might follow if she allowed herself to hope? The Duke of Wexford was no ordinary man. His every movement was catalogued, his every gesture dissected. To become the subject of speculation tied to him would be to walk willingly into fire. Yet in the depths of her, pride whispered that perhaps, after years of endurance, she was strong enough to endure one more flame. The evening wore on, and though he did not approach, the Duke's glance found her again and again, subtle as the tide yet impossible to ignore. Each time, Eleanor felt society's gaze sharpen, its judgment grow heavier, but beneath the weight something unlooked-for blossomed, the realization that she was not defined by their scorn but by the way she chose to carry it. For the first time in years, she wondered if dignity could be more than armor. It could be invitation, too. As midnight neared, Eleanor stood once more alone at the edge of the ballroom, a solitary figure in a world built for pairs. The cruel words of the young debutantes echoed faintly in memory, yet they no longer pierced so deeply. For across the glittering hall, the Duke of Wexford's bow lingered in her mind, a wordless recognition that spoke louder than the orchestra's triumphant finale. When she departed at last, stepping into the cold London night, the air smelled of rain upon stone, sharp and clean. The laughter and whispers of the ballroom faded behind her, yet the impression of his gaze remained, etched into her thoughts like a secret vow. Though nothing had been spoken, the evening had altered her path, tilting it toward something unknown yet perilously tempting. And as her carriage wheels clattered into the darkness, Eleanor could not decide whether she feared society's mockery more, or the dangerous hope now stirring in her heart. Rain fell upon London with the delicate insistence of fingers upon a pianoforte, soft at first, then gathering strength until the cobblestones gleamed as though varnished by a melancholy hand. Lady Eleanor Ashcombe, cloaked in dark velvet, walked with measured steps along the colonnade of the lending library, her parasol shielding little more than dignity from the persistent drizzle. She came often to this quiet sanctuary, for books had become her most loyal companions, volumes of history, of poetry, of essays that offered solace when the laughter of ballrooms had grown cruel. Yet this morning, as she moved between the oak shelves with their fragrance of leather and dust, she discovered a volume lying open upon a table near the window, Wordsworth's verses, familiar yet newly alive in the lamplight. At first she thought it abandoned, until she noticed the marginalia, written in a bold but elegant hand. A line had been underlined, the best portion of a good man's life. His little, nameless, unremembered acts of kindness and of love. Beneath it, a single note, truth endures longer than beauty. Eleanor traced the words with her gloved hand, and though she tried to dismiss it as coincidence, something within her whispered otherwise. When she lifted her gaze, she found the Duke of Wexford himself standing at the far end of the reading room, his tall figure silhouetted against the rain-smeared glass. He bowed slightly, not as one indulging in chance recognition, but as if he had anticipated this moment. Her heart, schooled to caution, clenched with alarm. Why should a man of his station trouble to place a book where she might find it? And yet, why had he written those words, if not to speak to a soul he believed would understand them? She closed the volume carefully, feeling its weight as though it were not mere paper and binding, but a token, a quiet offering in a world where loud declarations were dangerous. She inclined her head in the smallest acknowledgement, and when she glanced back, he had turned away, leaving only the echo of his presence and the book that now seemed warmer in her hands than the hearth awaiting her at home. The city soon feasted upon rumor. By the week's end, whispers slid across drawing-rooms as swiftly as carriages upon wet stone. "The Duke frequents the library more than Parliament," one remarked archly. "And not for the books, I dare say," added another. A baronet's wife declared she had seen him pause before Eleanor at the marketplace, and though no words were exchanged, the mere sight of his gaze upon her was enough to set tongues ablaze. Eleanor endured the speculation with a composure that cost her dearly. Behind closed doors she pressed her forehead against her hands and asked herself whether she had become a fool, ensnared by the smallest crumbs of attention, while society prepared to dine upon her humiliation. Yet the Duke did not retreat. At a ball held in honor of a visiting foreign dignitary, the air heavy with perfume and ambition, Eleanor stood apart as she so often did, her satin gown a sober shade amidst a sea of pastels. She expected, as ever, to watch from the margins, a spectator to youthful gaiety. But when the orchestra struck the opening notes of a waltz, the Duke crossed the room with the calm assurance of a man untroubled by consequence. He bowed before her, extending his hand with words uttered in a tone clear enough for all to hear. "Lady Eleanor, may I claim this dance?" The silence that followed was louder than the music. Heads turned, fans fluttered violently, and a dozen ambitious mothers stiffened in outrage. Eleanor's pulse hammered against her ribs, for she knew that to accept would be to court scandal, to reject would be to wound a man who had shown her uncommon respect. Dignity demanded caution, yet pride, long stifled, long denied, urged her to rise. And so she placed her hand upon his arm, her voice steady though her soul trembled. "It would be my honor, your grace." As they stepped onto the polished floor, whispers multiplied, 1,000 sharp arrows loosed at once. The Duke did not falter. His frame moved with the practiced grace of a man accustomed to command, yet his eyes remained fixed upon Eleanor, as though she were the only figure in the room. She felt her own steps strengthen under that gaze, and for a fleeting moment, the grandeur of the ballroom fell away. There were no spectators, no sneering girls, no calculating matrons, only the two of them, bound by rhythm and unspoken understanding. Yet society is seldom silent for long. A rival countess, a woman whose vanity was matched only by her cruelty, lifted her voice high enough to be carried over the violins. "How noble of his grace," she drawled, "to extend his charity to one so long neglected. Truly, it is a kindness to dance with the forgotten." Laughter, thin and cutting, followed her words, striking Eleanor's heart like glass against marble. For a moment she faltered, her steps threatened to betray her. But the Duke's grip upon her hand tightened, steadying her. He turned his head toward the Countess, his expression cool as frost. "Madam," he said, voice resonant, "charity is a gift offered where there is want. But to dance with Lady Eleanor is no charity, it is a privilege, and one that requires no defense save the envy of those who lack her grace." The Countess paled, her laughter dying upon her lips, while the surrounding company shifted uncomfortably, their whispers momentarily silenced by the blade of his words. Eleanor's breath caught. For years she had endured ridicule in silence, cloaking herself in dignity to survive. Now, before the eyes of society, someone had spoken, not for her, but with her, as if her worth were unquestionable. Gratitude surged within her, mingled with something more dangerous, something perilously close to longing. When the music ceased, applause rose politely, though it lacked its usual enthusiasm, for the room was still unsettled. The Duke escorted Eleanor to her seat, bowing with the formality of a courtier. Yet as he withdrew, his gaze lingered, and in it she saw neither pity nor defiance, but conviction, as though he had made a choice and would not be swayed. That night, alone in her carriage as rain spattered against the glass, Eleanor pressed her hand to her chest, where her heart still beat with the rhythm of the waltz. The scandal was certain to grow, tomorrow's conversations would be merciless, and yet beneath the dread coiled a fragile spark of exhilaration. For the first time in years, she did not feel like a ghost haunting the ballrooms of London. She felt seen, defended, and, most dangerously, desired. And though she told herself to be cautious, though she warned her own heart against the hazards of hope, Eleanor could not deny that the Duke's words had planted something in her that no ridicule could uproot. It was not yet love, perhaps, but it was the beginning of a story society would try to crush, and she, though afraid, longed to see what might come when a soul long mocked dared to step into the light. The carriage wheels crunched upon the gravel drive, scattering tiny stones like sparks as Lady Eleanor Ashcombe arrived at Wexford Hall. The estate loomed with solemn majesty, its tall windows glimmering with firelight against the dusk. She had come at the Duke's invitation, ostensibly to assist with a charitable project he sponsored for the local parish, yet her heart whispered that the summons carried a weight no philanthropy could conceal. The servants bowed with quiet deference, leading her into a hall where portraits of ancestors gazed down, stern and watchful, as though guarding the secrets that lay within these walls. Eleanor removed her cloak with careful hands, striving to suppress the tremor that ran through her fingers. She told herself this was no more than duty, a contribution to a cause she valued, yet her pulse belied the calm exterior she presented. She had endured weeks of society's gossip since that waltz, mockery sharpened into scandal, whispers swelling into certainty that the Duke's attentions must be some elaborate jest. Still, he had written again, each note brief but earnest, requesting her presence with a gravity that made refusal impossible. When he appeared, descending the grand staircase with unhurried steps, she felt the air shift as though the house itself acknowledged his authority. He was dressed plainly, his cravat tied without ostentation, his coat of dark wool rather than silk. Yet simplicity only magnified his presence. He bowed, not the cursory nod of one who commands, but a gesture deliberate, almost reverent. "Lady Eleanor," he said, his voice low, warm, carrying the resonance of a man accustomed to command yet softened by something more intimate. "I feared the rain might delay you. I am glad to see it has not." She inclined her head, summoning composure. "The rain, your grace, is seldom so troublesome as rumor. Yet I find both can be endured." The faintest smile touched his lips, as though her candor pleased him, and he offered his arm to guide her toward the drawing-room. The chamber was softened by firelight, shadows dancing along the carved mantel, books stacked upon tables beside fresh ink and quills. A map of the parish lay spread before the hearth, dotted with notes in his hand concerning schools, alms, and the welfare of the poor. Yet Eleanor could not fail to notice that the room's atmosphere was less of administration than of intimacy, the hush of rain against the panes, the scent of oak logs smoldering, the quiet that wrapped them in a cocoon apart from the clamor of London. They spoke first of the parish, of schools for orphans and relief for widows, matters close to Eleanor's heart. She spoke with eloquence born of conviction, and he listened, not with the politeness of a man entertaining a lady's diversions, but with the keen attention of one who valued her mind. "You perceive the needs with clarity," he said when she paused. "Where others speak of charity as spectacle, you see its substance. That is rare, my lady." Her cheeks warmed despite herself. "It is not rarity, your grace, but necessity. Women of my station must find purpose where society denies us place." She meant it as a statement of fact, yet the words carried a shade of bitterness she could not mask. The Duke's gaze grew thoughtful. He stepped nearer, his voice lowered as though confiding. "Is it truly society that denies you, or do you deny yourself its shallow currency? I have watched you, Lady Eleanor. When others mock, you endure with dignity. When others scorn, you remain unbent. Such fortitude is not born of neglect, but of strength." Her breath caught. She had long shielded herself with composure, never expecting anyone to look beneath it. To hear him speak thus, as though he had seen through the armor, unsettled her more deeply than any ridicule. "You mistake endurance for contentment," she replied, though her voice wavered. "I have no illusions, sir. I know well how I am regarded." His expression softened, and in the glow of the fire his features seemed carved by both sorrow and resolve. "I know too well the cruelty of judgment. They praised my late wife for her beauty, her charm, yet when grief consumed me, not one of those voices offered solace. They courted my influence, not my heart. In silence I discovered what truly matters, not youth nor ornament but truth. And in you, Lady Eleanor, I see truth." The word struck her with force, and for an instant she could not reply. To be named thus, not in pity but in reverence, unsettled the walls she had so carefully built. She turned from him, gazing into the flames as though their restless tongues might steady her thoughts. You speak with conviction, Your Grace, but conviction is not constancy. Grief may cloud your sight. You seek comfort, perhaps, and in time you will return to society's expectations. I could not endure to be your diversion. He moved closer still, his presence enveloping without encroaching, his voice hushed yet certain. You wrong me if you believe this is comfort I seek. My loneliness is not eased by the chatter of drawing rooms nor by the company of youth. What I crave is understanding, the rare gift of being seen without pretense. In your silence I perceive thought, in your solitude I perceive strength. My lady, it is not loneliness that draws me to you, but the joy of being understood. Her hand trembled where it rested upon the mantle. Every syllable tempted her toward belief, yet fear gnawed at her heart. To yield to such words was to risk ruin if they proved false. She dared not meet his eyes, for in them she feared she might see too much of her own longing reflected. At last she whispered, You speak dangerously, Your Grace. To be understood is a luxury few can afford. Then let us be extravagant, he replied, his tone carrying both tenderness and resolve. For a moment, silence bound them. The fire crackled, the rain pressed upon the windows, their breaths mingled in the charged air between them. His hand moved as if to take hers, then halted, suspended by the fragile boundary she had drawn. The restraint itself became intimate, more powerful than touch. Eleanor closed her eyes, struggling against the tide within her. Part of her yearned to place her hand in his, to surrender the solitude that had defined her life. Yet another part recoiled, terrified of ridicule, terrified of hope betrayed. With sudden resolve she withdrew, stepping back, gathering her composure like a cloak. Forgive me, Your Grace, she said, her voice steadier than her heart. It grows late. I should not impose further upon your hospitality. He inclined his head, though disappointment shadowed his features. As you wish, Lady Eleanor. Yet know this, my words were not born of whim, nor will they fade with the night. They are as enduring as the truth I see in you. She curtsied, the motion graceful yet hurried, and allowed the servant to lead her from the room. As she stepped once more into the damp night, the rain touched her face like tears she refused to shed. Within her chest, war raged between fear and fragile hope. She told herself to be cautious, that dignity must shield her from despair. Yet no matter how firmly she resolved, the echo of his voice lingered, the joy of being understood. And though she departed alone, the walls she had built around her heart bore their first fracture, through which light, dangerous, dazzling, had begun to seep. The royal assembly glittered with ruthless magnificence, the palace ballroom a cathedral of candlelight where every facet of society's hierarchy came to preen and contend. Jewels blazed against velvet bodices, gold braid caught the fire of chandeliers, and the very air seemed laden with perfume, ambition, and expectation. It was here, under the watchful gaze of monarch and courtiers alike, that Lady Eleanor Ashcombe stepped into the lion's den. Her gown, of deep sapphire silk, shimmered with understated dignity, yet she knew well that to half the eyes upon her she was nothing more than a curiosity, the woman too long unmarried, the one who had somehow attracted the Duke of Wexford's notice, an anomaly to be dissected with every turn of a fan. Eleanor's heart beat with steady resolve, though unease pressed heavily upon her chest. Weeks had passed since that night at Wexford Hall, weeks in which his words had echoed in her solitude like the toll of a church bell, impossible to silence, impossible to forget. She had tried to retreat into caution, to assure herself his attentions would fade, but his constancy defied all expectation. Invitations arrived bearing his name, brief notes that spoke of books he thought she might admire, of causes he wished her counsel upon. He never pressed, never demanded, yet each gesture was a quiet declaration, one society had already seized upon with ravenous delight. And now, summoned by tradition to this royal gathering, Eleanor knew she could not remain hidden. To stand beside him here would either elevate her beyond mockery or condemn her to public ruin. Still, when she entered the hall and saw him across the expanse, tall, solemn, commanding in his black coat trimmed with silver, her composure trembled. He was speaking with a minister, his expression courteous yet distant, until his eyes found hers. In that instant the press of the crowd faded, and all the cruelty of whispered speculation lost its power. For in his gaze she saw neither pity nor pretense, but unwavering certainty. The music swelled, and the first waltz was announced. Partners formed, silks rustled, jewels flashed. Eleanor felt the old instinct to retreat, to fade into the perimeter where the overlooked and unvalued stood. Yet the Duke cut through the throng with deliberate steps, each one silencing conversation as though the very floor bowed to his intent. He reached her with a bow of impeccable formality, his voice carrying across the hush. "Lady Eleanor, may I have this dance?" The silence that followed was thunderous. Some gasped openly, others exchanged sharp glances over feathered fans. Eleanor's pulse hammered, for she knew her choice in this moment would bind her fate. If she refused, she would spare herself fresh scandal but wound the man who had offered her the rarest of honors. If she accepted, she would step into a blaze of scrutiny that might consume her entirely. Her pride, long tempered by endurance, lifted her chin. "You may, Your Grace," she replied, her voice clear, her hand steady as it rested upon his arm. They moved onto the floor, and the orchestra began its stately strains. Around them, dancers whirled in practiced elegance, yet Eleanor felt the world had contracted to a single circle of light where only she and the Duke existed. His hand upon her back was firm, respectful, anchoring her steps when her breath threatened to falter. "Courage suits you," he murmured, his words audible only to her. "Do not doubt that you belong here." She answered with restraint, though emotion pricked at her composure. "Belonging is not granted so easily. You test the patience of every eye in this room." "Then let them stare," he said, his gaze steady. "Let them see what I see, and envy it." As they turned, she caught sight of the Countess who had mocked her before, lips curled in disdain, whispering to her companions. Eleanor's instinct was to shrink from the sting, but the Duke's eyes held hers, unflinching. In their depths she found a shield stronger than silence, and for the first time she met the malice of the room not with retreat but with calm defiance. The waltz carried them across polished floors, their movements a dialogue unspoken yet profound. Every step declared what words had not yet fully dared, that he had chosen her, not in secret shadows but in the brilliance of the crown's own court. As the music drew to its crescendo, whispers swelled like a tide breaking against rock. "He is mad," some said. "She must have ensnared him." Others speculated of politics, of hidden motives, of scandal that would surely end in disgrace. And then, at the music's final note, the Duke did not merely bow and retreat. He remained before her, his hand still holding hers, his voice resonant enough to reach the ears of those nearest. "Lady Eleanor," he said, his tone calm yet commanding, "to dance with you here, before all, is no whim. It is acknowledgment. You are the only woman whose presence grants me peace, whose counsel I value, whose dignity humbles even my pride. If society finds that remarkable, so be it." A shock swept through the crowd, audible in its collective gasp. Eleanor felt her knees weaken, her composure fray, but pride lifted her once more. She answered not with girlish flushes nor with tears, but with quiet resolve. "Your Grace honors me beyond measure," she said, her voice steady despite the storm around them. "Yet let us hope the worth of a soul may one day be judged as highly as its ornaments." The monarch himself, seated upon an elevated dais, had observed in silence. Now he leaned toward a minister, murmuring with faint amusement. Though his words were too soft for most to hear, the ripple of his smile spread swiftly. Approval, subtle yet unmistakable, passed like a benediction through the hall. The sharpest tongues stilled, the cruelest whispers faltered, for few dared oppose even the shadow of royal favor. Eleanor stood taller, though her heart thudded with disbelief. She had endured ridicule for decades, her worth measured by absence. Now, before all, she had been named with reverence by the most sought-after man in England, and the monarchy itself had not rebuked it. She felt the stir of triumph, fragile but undeniable. When at last the Duke escorted her from the floor, the crowd parted with a curious silence, half scandal, half awe. He bent his head toward her as though shielding her from their gaze. "Forgive me," he said quietly, "for making you the center of their cruelty. But I would sooner face their scorn than deny what I hold true." Her reply came soft, yet resolute. "Then I shall endure with you, your grace. But do not mistake endurance for indifference. It costs much to stand where I do." His eyes softened, and though he spoke no further declaration, the promise in his gaze was enough. She knew he would not waver, no matter the weight of society's scorn. And as the orchestra struck the next melody, Eleanor felt, for the first time in her life, that dignity need not be her only companion. She had gained something rarer, a champion who saw not her solitude but her soul. Yet beneath the triumph lingered unease, for she understood too well that society's malice was not so easily conquered. Approval might silence them for a night, but envy was a serpent that slithered in silence, waiting for its hour. As she left the ballroom at the Duke's side, pride swelling yet tempered by caution, Eleanor knew the story was far from ended. The most perilous test lay ahead, not in whispers but in the quiet choices of the heart. Dawn broke pale and unadorned over London, the fog curling like unspoken secrets along the Thames, and Lady Eleanor Ashcombe rose with a heaviness in her chest she could no longer disguise. The royal assembly had passed, leaving her name entwined with the Duke of Wexford's in every drawing-room, every marketplace, every whispered conversation at church pews. Some spoke with admiration, others with venom, but none with indifference. For the first time in her life, Eleanor had become the subject of England's insatiable gaze, and though his steadfastness had shielded her from humiliation, she knew the true test was yet to come. Society could forgive eccentricity, it could forgive scandal, but it rarely forgave defiance, least of all from a woman it had marked as unworthy. When the Duke's carriage arrived at her modest townhouse later that morning, its crest gleaming despite the mist, she understood his intent without need of words. He entered with solemnity, dismissing servants to ensure privacy, and stood before her hearth as though preparing to defend a cause in Parliament. His eyes, steady and unwavering, fixed upon her with the same intensity that had unsettled and emboldened her since their first encounter. "Eleanor," he began, discarding formality in the intimacy of her parlor, "I have stood upon battlefields where cannon fire shook the earth beneath me, yet I confess my resolve has never been tested as it is now. I must speak plainly, my heart is yours, and I will not retreat." The words landed with both sweetness and dread. She sat rigid, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as though the force of his declaration might shatter her composure. "You speak with fire, your grace, but fire consumes as well as warms," she replied. "Do you not see what you ask of me? To stand beside you is to bear the weight of every sneer, every slander, every envy sharpened into cruelty. I have endured much, but this may break me." He crossed the room with measured steps, kneeling beside her chair in a gesture no duke need offer any woman, let alone one deemed beneath the notice of his world. "It will not break you," he said softly, "because you have been unbroken all your life. They mocked you for solitude, yet you endured with grace. They pitied you for absence, yet you lived with purpose. Eleanor, I do not admire you despite your trials, I admire you because of them. And I would sooner face the scorn of England than live a life gilded by falsehoods without you." Her eyes stung, though she willed no tears to fall. She had been taught since girlhood that emotion betrayed weakness, that dignity demanded silence. Yet here, before this man whose sincerity stripped away her defenses, she felt the perilous temptation to believe. "And if I falter?" she whispered. if their cruelty pierces deeper than pride can shield? He took her hand gently, his thumb brushing the ridges of age-time had written there. Then let me be your shield, he said. Not to silence them, for they will never cease, but to stand with you so their words cannot reach you alone. The chamber seemed to still, the fire crackling softly as if bearing witness. Eleanor closed her eyes, and in the darkness she saw the long years of solitude, the endless corridors of ballrooms where she had walked invisible, the cruel laughter that had followed her like a shadow. To choose him was to expose herself anew, but to refuse him was to condemn herself to the same silence forever. She drew breath, steadying her voice. If I yield to this, your grace, I yield not to charity, nor to indulgence, but to truth. And if you betray that truth, I will not, he interjected, his tone firm yet tender. My constancy will be your proof. She opened her eyes, and the firelight flickered across his face, illuminating not youth or perfection, but conviction. Slowly, Eleanor placed her other hand upon his, a gesture small yet irrevocable. Then let us face them together, she said. The announcement of their union spread like wildfire through England. Some called it folly, others scandal, but many, though begrudgingly, began to speak of courage. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor walked beside the Duke in gardens, attended services at his parish, and received visitors at Wexford Hall. Each outing was a battlefield where whispers hissed and fans fluttered like drawn blades, yet she stood tall, her hand upon his arm, her gaze unflinching. Slowly, society's derision faltered, unable to reconcile its cruel caricature with the dignified woman who neither cowered nor clung. One evening, as spring unfolded in blossoms along the avenues, Eleanor and the Duke stood upon the terrace of his estate. The air was cool, fragrant with lilac, the sky painted in the bruised hues of twilight. He drew her close, his voice low and solemn. When first I bowed to you across that ballroom, I did so not to provoke society, but because I recognized in you what I thought long lost, integrity unmarred by vanity. You have given me back the belief that love is not mere ornament, but substance. She rested her hand against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm beneath. And you, she answered, her voice softened yet sure, have given me back what I thought beyond my reach, the knowledge that solitude need not be the price of dignity. That to be loved is not to be diminished, but to be seen entire. They stood together in the encroaching night, the hush of the world wrapping around them like benediction. Beyond the estate, society still murmured, still speculated, still sought to measure their union against its rigid scales. But within the circle of his arms, Eleanor felt a peace more profound than applause, more enduring than scandal. For the first time in 4 decades of life, she did not feel defined by absence, but by presence, the presence of a man who cherished her soul above all adornments. And though the road ahead promised further trials, Eleanor knew the truth they shared could not be undone by ridicule. In an age where appearances reigned supreme, they had chosen the rarest rebellion, to love openly, defiantly, sincerely. It was not the end of her story, nor his, but the beginning of one written not by society's decree, but by their own unyielding hearts.